Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today, now that we're in webinar format. My name is Dr. Trina Shanks. I'm a Director of Community Engagement here at the School of Social Work and a professor. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. I'm wearing glasses, have curly black hair, and a thick navy blue sweater because it's cold outside today. In terms of accessibility, if you hit CC or show subtitle, it will activate captions. And if you want to toggle between the gallery view and the speaker view, you can just see the PowerPoint slide and who's talking. But I have an opportunity to introduce, or at least to set up a special session today. We're exploring the use of facial recognition, its use, and its harmful effects. Next slide. But before we get started, as always, we'd like to take a moment to give a brief land and labor acknowledgement. As an engaged team, we're fully aware that we function within a society that has a deep history of exploitation, stealing both land and labor, that has affected and shaped our Indigenous and Black communities for generations. We're committed to acknowledging this in everything that we do to try to help create a more inclusive tomorrow. So I will give you a few minutes to read our land and labor acknowledgement. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I will introduce our dynamic and growing engaged team. We have Sonia Harb, who's the Detroit Engagement Specialist. We have Aisha Ghazi Edwin, who's leading this class and is also a lecturer in the School of Social Work. We have Fatima Salman, who's the Engaged Program Manager. We have Sarah Bachar, who's a Program Assistant. And then we have our wonderful student intern, Savannah Rayan. So thank you for everyone who's on the Engaged team for making this happen. And now I'm going to turn it over to Aisha.
Thanks so much, Trina. This is Aisha. My name is Aisha Ghazi Edwin. I use the pronoun she, her, and hers. I'm a person with short black hair, wearing a gray jacket with a white shirt. And we do that for accessibility purposes. So it's also copied into the transcript in case someone needs it. So I have the pleasure of facilitating this session today, along with our intern, Savannah, who will be introducing herself soon. As Dr. Shanks described, this is a special session exploring the use of facial recognition technology and its impact on our society. Savannah, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Aisha. I'm Savannah Rayan. I am a student intern at Detroit Engage with the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and I will be co-facilitating today's session with Aisha. I'm a person with long, dark hair. I'm wearing a black shirt and a black blazer, and I'm also wearing a necklace. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Savannah. This is Aisha. So for all attendees, please make sure to mute yourself throughout this session. And this is meant to be an interactive session. If you have questions during the session, feel free to put them in the comments or in the Q&A box. We'll try our best to answer them, but we will be devoting 15 minutes at the end of the session for some question and answer. And at that time, you can also use the raise hand function. So now I would like to give each of our amazing panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. If you can please advance, thank you. So using the prompts on the next slide, if each panelist can introduce themselves, and why don't we start with Dr. Molly Kleinman.
Thanks, Aisha. Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Kleinman. I use she, her pronouns. I have long brown hair and I'm wearing a purple sweater and glasses. I am the managing director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy, where we study the social equity and justice implications of a wide range of science and technology. We published a report in 2020 called Cameras in the Classroom that focused on the implications of facial recognition technology in schools, which at the time that we started doing that research in 2019 was mostly just theoretical. And by the time it came out in mid-2020 and the pandemic had started and the use of cameras in education was really skyrocketing. But we also look at facial recognition and other surveillance technologies and lots of other contexts as well. Oh, and I'm going to put a link to the report in the chat.
Thank you so much, Molly. Wadood, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Wadood. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a person with short black hair wearing a green button down over a beige shirt. And I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of Michigan, which is based in Detroit, but does work statewide. And my focus there is on examining and challenging the oftentimes toxic role that police plays in our public safety infrastructure and in society in general.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ramis. Next up, can we have Alejandro Navarrete, if you can introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yeah, I'm Alejandro Navarrete. Pronouns are he, him. I am a light brown man, no hair, against the off-white wall. Yeah, I'm the Policy and Research Director here at Detroit Action, where, at Detroit Action, we organize Black and Brown working class Detroiters on the issues that affect them directly, centering them and their needs first. And in my role, I connect existing research like what we're going to talk about today to support the claims of in the advocacy that people bring forth when talking to electeds at every level, city, state, federal. Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you so much. We're excited to have you. Eric Williams, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Eric Williams. I use he, him pronouns. I am a brown-skinned Black man with salt and pepper scruff and what I like to consider prematurely gray short hair. I am the managing director of the economic equity practice at the Detroit Justice Center, which is my day gig. I came to this work because Project Greenlight just offended all my sensibilities. Mm-hmm. And so from the moment the program was announced, I have just been pretty much as opposed to it as possible. So while artificial intelligence and the like play a significant role in the work I do during my day job, my involvement with Project Greenlight and facial recognition specifically, as I said, just rooted to my personal indignation that this program even exists.
Yeah, I can imagine. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in a bit. So I think, why don't we just dive straight into the conversation? And Savannah, if you could just go back to the panel. Yep, that would be great. Thank you. So, starting off, and this is a question for any of you, feel free to jump in. What is facial recognition technology? And how is it made? And how is it being used?
So I can jump in here if giving a brief overview. So there are basically two kinds of facial recognition. One is facial verification. The other one is facial identification, or otherwise sort of known as one-to-one and one-to-many. And the way it operates is, for example, with one-to-one, it's the kind of thing that opens, your iPhone or a picture on a badge where artificial intelligence identifies the face and that's essentially a probe image, identifies the face, goes and sort of identifies certain markers, essentially creating a template that is then compared to what's been presented to it. So it answers one-to-one, answers the question, are you this person? The more pernicious kind is one-to-many, and it's basically the same program, except it's not comparing it to one image that has been, it goes through the same process of creating a template, but with points for comparison, but it's not drawing the comparison from, one image that is the person who you're trying to verify. it's drawing from a larger database, and which can be nationwide, statewide. It can include, literally millions of people, and then tries to make a comparison there. And the output is typically sort of a confidence score, which is how closely does the template that's been presented, the points on that, how closely does that match individuals in whatever database you have of photos. So that's essentially how it works. And I mean, there are a lot of problems with how with many parts of that process, but that's the general overview of how facial recognition operates.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Eric. So it sounds like it feeds these programs are fed these templates of people's pictures.
Essentially, yes. And the quality of that very much depends on the quality of the picture that you have. So
Right.
It depends on whether or not it's taken from, social media posting or your identification or whatever. There's a lot of variety, which is why you get a lot of, which is why there's a lot of variety as far as matches, simply because if a picture isn't, if the two pictures being compared weren't taken from the same angle, under the same light, using the same quality camera, there's a lot of variation there.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Would any of the other panelists want to jump in here?
I think Eric was comprehensive. I'll just add in terms of, how the technology is employed, kind of on the ground. It depends in different places. So, police departments tend to use what Eric mentioned as the one-to-many, as an investigative tool. They have surveillance footage, a picture from some incident, and they feed it into, a platform that's run by these facial recognition algorithms, to kind of search through whatever database they have access to. It could be driver's licenses, could be, mugshots, it could be something else. And, the program is essentially trying to take that input footage or that input photo, dig through this huge database and try to find the closest match. And like Eric mentions, in most cases, it spits out a confidence interval, like the program is this percent or this number confident that it's going to be a match. Other agencies use it differently. If you've been to the airport recently, you might have been asked, which you can refuse to do, but you might have been asked to kind of lower your mask and look into a camera, and after they scan your ID or boarding pass. That's more of a one-to-one, just to make sure you're the same person whose ID they're scanning, just to confirm that you are that person. So you'll see this employed in different ways in different places. But overall, the infrastructure that Eric has kind of outlined is the one that's being employed.
Thanks, Ramis. When you were talking about the training sets, Eric, I was wondering, do they tend to, and this is a question for all of you, do they tend to have representative samples of diverse populations? So like, are they feeding it enough pictures of, I guess, you know what point I'm getting to, of Black people, of brown people, so that the machine or the program understands the diversity that exists within these groups?
I think that's a big no.
It's a big no.
That's one of the problems you have with artificial intelligence, generally speaking, that it's only as good as the data set it's trained on, right? So, for example, in healthcare, you use artificial intelligence to for diagnoses and all those sorts of things. But if you have, for example, women or people of color or non-cis people who are underrepresented in the data set, then its ability to do its job is really limited. It's similar with the training sets used for artificial intelligence and for facial recognition. People of color, particularly Black women, are really underrepresented, which means that it's really poor at making those connections. The artificial intelligence facial recognition is very accurate when it comes to white men, right? But if it comes to dealing with persons with disabilities, if it comes to dealing with people who are transgender, when it comes to dealing with women, almost anything else, it suddenly is much less accurate, which makes you wonder why you deployed in the city 84% Black. But, you know, that's just the way I think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Alejandro, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I think what just as much as it is about the training sets that are used in training these algorithms, is how these algorithms are going to be designed to differentiate between the intricacies and differences between different features. And so what I mean by that is that, you know, the reason why that or I should say, the point that I'm getting at is that these tend to be developed by mostly white developers. And that's emblematic as to what that is, sorry, that the symptom of that is how the training data sets don't use, say, Black people with that represents the diversity in the features of Black people. What they will train on is white faces that, and the data set will have the diversity of the different features that white people have, which is why it's so accurate. And
Right.
the reason why, you know, the race of the developers has something to do with it is because it's going to be a lot more intuitive for a white person to understand, oh, you know, someone who is, you know, Germanic of Germanic ancestry is going to have these different features. So let's make sure we include those folks. Whereas, you know, to the same developer, people of color, say, you know, Hispanic people, Black people may seem more monolithic. They may not make sure that they're including all all that diversity in the data set. So it's just about, you know, it's not just what the data set contains, it's about who designed that data set to begin with. And yeah, and research has been done that, you know, once you increase that diversity in the development stage, then the accuracy does tend to go up because you have that intuitive knowledge of as to the diversity that's required in this data set. Yeah.
Could I add one point? Because what Alex said is really important, because the people, what you have are developers who aren't representative of the community where this kind of technology is predominantly deployed, right? I mean, it's not just that it was developed primarily by white developers, but that it's being implemented in predominantly non-white communities, right? So there is an additional level of disconnect between, you know, the people most impacted by it and the people who are actually developing it, and in many instances, you know, deploying it, right? It is across the board geared towards criminalizing in many respects Black and brown communities.
Yeah, and I want to build on, I just want to build on that for a second because, you know, this started with a question about accuracy. And it's true that facial recognition is inaccurate, and it's inaccurate in very biased ways. But even if facial recognition was perfectly accurate, and even if it returned an accurate result every single time, the outcomes would still be inequitable, and the way it's applied would still be biased. And so often when we start talking about the ways bias is baked into certain technologies, people will think about, well, how can we fix that? How can we diversify the training data? How can we diversify the development teams? And with a tool like facial recognition that's so predominantly used for surveillance, the more perfect and accurate a tool is, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be less harmful.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I was reading a little bit in your report, Molly, just about how white males will enjoy an accuracy rate of something like 99%. And then, you know, when it comes to African American Asian faces, they are misidentified 10 to 100 times more than Caucasian faces. And then again, you know, as was spoken to earlier, it tends to have a higher error rate with people who are transgender, because it tends to use, a lot of these programs will use binary, you know, male, female kind of genders, people with disabilities, youth. And then you were just started to bring up kind of how it's, even if there wasn't a bias in its creation and its implementation, it tends to increase disparities. For example, we see it actively increasing disparities, racial disparities in the criminal legal system. Can anyone speak a little bit more to kind of the other applications that it's being used for, in addition to policing?
So this, Eric talked about this when he was explaining the technology at the start. Identity verification is a big one. And when we're talking about social services, we're seeing things like using it for verifying that a person taking a certain kind of test is the person that they say they are. And even though those identity verification systems are often one-to-one, where it's like, you know, here's my driver's license and here's the picture of my driver's license and here's me in front of you, the systems can still fail. And again, those failures are more likely for people who are already experiencing some other kind of marginalization, which then can have the impact of making that person say, well, this service is not for me. I can't, or it just makes it impossible for them to access whatever that service is. So even in identity verification, where it's often supposed to improve efficiency, improve accuracy, there's all of this marketing language around the ways it will make it easier for the people who are applying the system. It can still cause a lot of harm.
I think it should also be noted that and those are very good points. The one-on-one identification isn't harmless necessarily the way people think. The other issue is that we're not talking about simply an identification for a moment, right? We've gotten to the point where facial recognition can be part of something that creates, persistent unique identifier. Which enables, for example, a surveillance system to follow someone around a city from camera to camera, because the AI behind it is able to say, okay, there's this person we're following them. And you're not only taking that person, the image of that person, you're connecting them to you can connect them to lots of other information in other databases. So you're seeing this face and you're able to pull up, address, associates, driver's license, all of these things that become connected to you. And when you're talking about connecting someone, perhaps mistakenly, to background and information and, personal details that may be inaccurate, the possible consequences for that, everything from law enforcement to healthcare to, something like, access to a particular database, it becomes real problematic real fast. And it's almost hidden simply because it so often acts as a black box. Most people don't understand, and even many of the developers don't understand how artificial intelligence, even as applied to facial recognition, actually works. So
Right.
it's difficult to complain about it or recommend solutions to it.
Right. And is there any transparency in terms of the algorithms that are being used? Can you guys speak to that?
Proprietary. Well, and not only proprietary. I mean, if you ask a lot of AI developers, they'll tell you they literally don't know what's happening in this black box, right? I mean, I described earlier sort of the general process for facial recognition, but the truth is, for some of the more sophisticated and more nuanced applications, they literally don't know, and they will tell you, which is why we get hallucinations and the like in AI. But there is no sort of public disclosure generally to how it works. Many people are under the assumption that the match threshold, like the number that gets kicked back that says whether or not this is a possible match, many people are under the impression that that's an objective set number, and it's not, right? So When it comes to looking at an image, you're looking for matches. If you want a lot of matches, you set the threshold very low. If you want fewer matches that are probably closer matches, then you set the threshold very high. But that's something the user can do. That's not some, I mean, it's not as though there's some objective right match threshold that's being applied here. And I guarantee you, for example, in Detroit, I would almost bet you every dollar I have that most of our city council who approved Project Greenlight doesn't understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it would be good to maybe expand a little bit on Project Greenlight. If you could advance Savannah to slide number 10. Thank you. So, this here, we have a map of all the spots where Project Greenlight is being used on the left, and on the right, using 2010 census data. It's showing, racial demographics and concentrations throughout the city of Detroit. And it's pretty clear that Project Greenlight is overlaid heavily on top of predominantly Black areas. Eric, I know that you've done work with Project Greenlight. I believe a few of you have done some work with it. Can you explain a little bit more about what it is?
I feel like I've talked a lot, so if someone else wants to go, otherwise
Anyone can jump in.
I like to describe it as the mafia, or a new form of the mafia. It's a public-private partnership between the city and local businesses, where local businesses pay a fee to the city for kind of the police department to have kind of an eye on the ground at those businesses in the form of kind of security footage and a flashing green light. So if any of you in the audience have been to Detroit, especially if you're driving down a main street like Woodward or 8 Mile, you'll see these like strings of flashing green lights, which indicate that you are part of this Project Greenlight program. And not only do you get kind of real-time access to, or not only does the police department get real-time access to the security cameras it sets up at your business, but you get kind of priority police service. And to kind of make the mafia analogy even more clear, the police even stops by, once a month or on a regular basis to check on your business, as long as you have paid your fees. And so it's kind of this process where somehow businesses are paying for the police to expand their kind of web of surveillance into kind of the private space and open up those businesses to police surveillance as well. But Eric, if I've missed anything, I think you're the expert here.
So that's a really good description, and the mafia analogy is actually pretty accurate. I guess a few other points I'd point out is that one, this creates problems because from a jurisprudence perspective, because the cameras aren't owned by DPD. They are owned by the by the business owner who then streams them to DPD, which means that the normal limitations that you would have on police surveillance really don't come into play. We really don't have guardrails that address this. The other thing is that the store owner, the business owner, pays for installation of the cameras and the lights and the sign. The police department selects where the cameras are put up. Every site has to have 4 to 6 cameras that capture the images and license plates of people and vehicles entering the property as well as leaving the property. There's also a roughly $400 to like $1,000 a month cost for streaming and storing the video. And to top it all off, right now we have roughly, a little over 5,000 cameras based on the number of green light signs and 4 to 6 cameras per location, which means we've got like 5,000 video feeds flowing into the real-time crime centers. The problem, of course, is that I think everybody knows it is impossible for human beings to monitor that many cameras real time. It's just simply, it's a joke, right? They aren't being monitored live. I mean, they may from time to time be monitored live, but they really aren't being monitored live because it's unrealistic. If they were being monitored live, we would have DPD saying all the time, look, we caught somebody from, on the basis of a Project Greenlight sort of identification that there was a crime taking place, as opposed to responding to, for example, a 911 call. I would also add that under the partnership agreement, there's no requirement that DPD actually ever monitor the cameras, though they can when they want to. And I guess finally, I would say that every other law enforcement agency in the country that comes to DPD and makes a request can monitor the videos if they want. So the video feeds can be seen by, alphabet boys, ICE, INS, FBI, CIA, NI, they can all request and get access to these live streams if they want to. So that's sort of a general overview of the program, which for the record has not been shown to have any impact on community safety.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add a little bit of history there. So there was already brought up. There was a window in which Project Greenlight existed and was pushed on to business owners, where there wasn't any, embedded facial recognition technology. This was just sold as just round the clock video surveillance for your business. And and the way that this was pushed on, folks was like the city would actually ask community organizations to subsidize the implementation of these cameras on these businesses. And then it was only then after this was massively adopted that they then started embedding the facial recognition into this infrastructure. So a lot of this surveillance that's going on and the facial recognition that's taking place happened without necessarily the consent of the owners of these cameras. That didn't have that transparency to actually make a decision as to whether or not they'd be helping to deploy facial recognition. And then another thing that Eric alluded to is the fact that this is data that is not just held by DPD. If anything, DPD doesn't even hold on to most of the time. This is held in offsite servers for the video. And then when it's being sent for facial recognition analysis, it's sent to another server and stored there. And that's how usually these are accessed by the alphabet boys, is by asking for a request to then be able to download it elsewhere. So a lot of times DPD will say, well, we'll delete it after 30 days, 90 days, what have you. But it's still stored offsite, and they don't have any control over the Amazon servers, so it can live in perpetuity. And once it's recorded, streamed through the internet, we lose control over it.
It's alarming. It's very alarming. It's really about like commodifying data. I was reading something, I think it's while doing research for this, that about in 2016, there was an estimate that a little over half of Americans, about 117 million, have their photos uploaded to some sort of facial recognition software. And we don't really know where that data goes. We know that how it is used, these programs tend to heavily misidentify Black and Brown individuals and other marginalized populations. Can any of you speak to kind of just how our data is being commodified and where it's going a little bit more? And potentially, are there rules or regulations around it?
That part's easy. There are not in the US. They're starting to be. There was the AI Bill of Rights that came out of the Biden administration. In Europe, they have something called the General Data Protection Regulation, which it holds for even US companies operating in Europe. But for the most part, users in the US don't get the protections that users in Europe are getting around user data. And I think the thing that's important to remember about specifically faces as data is that well, you age over time and you can grow a beard or shave a beard. Your face is your face. And once a person is in one of these databases, that's it. Their face, like they have lost control of their face. And this is true for a lot of different kinds of biometric tools. There, you know, now we're talking about retina scanners, and we're talking about, and we've had fingerprints for a long time, but we really don't have protections in this country. You know, the Congress wants to ban TikTok, and really what we need is privacy regulation that affects all of these companies, that protects all Americans, regardless of which kinds of tech companies we're talking about, if it's social media or something like a facial recognition tool.
Yeah, 100%.
I would add, I'm sorry. I would add, when you talk about the number of faces in the database, right? So in Michigan, law enforcement primarily uses a database called SNAP, Statewide Network of Agency Photos. There are more photos in that database than there are people in the state of Michigan. And it includes every driver's license, every non-driving identification card photo. It includes basically every photo ever collected in a criminal investigation, which is, you know, at first glance may not seem particularly problematic. But remember, anytime you do, if there's an investigation going on, the person who's suspected of a crime, who, by the way, may be innocent, isn't the only person who's involved in that investigation. They also frequently are taking a look at their friends, family, you know, neighbors, people they encounter on the street. And those people end up in this database as well. And it may be pictures from their social media accounts, it may be surveillance photos. But the point is, not only are these pictures in there, they're usually not very good photos. So the amount of data that's out there that's being used by a vast array of law enforcement agency is, you know, particularly troubling. A lot of this, and then this information inevitably finds its way into the hands of, you know, marketers like e-commerce sites and the like. So, you know, your face is out there, someone's got it, and you're probably not aware of what they're doing with it.
Scary. It's very scary. And you know, I want to kind of backtrack a little bit, because our country has, you know, it has a long history of surveilling Black and brown populations. If you, Savannah, could please go to the slide with the lantern laws. So this is something that we found as an example, which is, I don't know if any of the panelists have heard of this, which is really alarming, how back in the 18th century, there were laws that required, you know, Black people to carry these lanterns to identify their faces. And just the way that we have made sure that society fears Black and brown people have really helped to inform some of these laws, these surveillance laws that then are heavily applied in Black and brown communities and increase disparities. Is there any kind of information that you guys have just about other types of surveillance laws, how they connect to history and what's happening today?
I can jump in on this a little bit, because we talked about the lantern laws in the facial recognition in schools report. But the basic premise is that you're making people more visible to authorities. And that when you, and this is where the argument I was making earlier, that even perfectly accurate facial recognition would cause harm, and it would cause harm in unequal ways, is because some people are more at risk when they become more perfectly visible to authorities than other people. More likely to be pulled into the criminal legal system, more likely to be harassed. And we have had variations on these attempts at increasing visibility throughout the history of technology. In a lot of ways, the history of technology really is a history of the criminal legal system, and it really is a history of surveillance and control. And lantern laws are a particularly stark example, but we've got things like mugshots, things like fingerprints, all of these different ways where we're trying to record and document people's bodies in order to track and control them.
Yeah.
One of the things I think it sounds strange to point out, but so far this entire discussion has been premised on, you know, legally, I don't want to say legally, but sort of a use of facial recognition that is at least supported by, you know, sort of apparent need, right? We haven't talked about there being any sort of blatant racism involved in this, or anything more nefarious other than perhaps sort of the institutional and admittedly quite significant racism that's there. But the truth is, once you create a surveillance infrastructure, it's inevitable that it's going to be abused. And we can talk about COINTELPRO, we can go back to the Ghetto Informant Program, surveillance of Muslims in the aftermath of 9/11. It is almost a guarantee that a surveillance infrastructure will be abused. It's just kind of always the way it happens. And I think it's important to talk about infrastructure because, you know, Project Greenlight, for example, in Detroit is a problem, right? But it becomes, the problem grows exponentially when you consider that we not only have Project Greenlight, we have license plate readers, we have, you know, shot spotters, the gunshot allegedly gunshot detection technology. There are all these different surveillance programs at work at once. We can rest assured that they will be abused, and they have, similar systems have been abused in the aftermath of Freddie Gray, or during the Freddie Gray protests in Baltimore. You literally had you know, reports of the police department using facial recognition to identify people in the protests who had outstanding warrants, right? So talk about, you know, a chilling effect on, you know, free speech. So it's going to be abused, and right now there are, in the United States, there are virtually no laws in place to address that, and Detroit in particular has almost no rules other than general policies by DPD, which are kind of weak, that address misuse of this kind of technology. And that's a problem that's over, you know, above and beyond the problems that we're seeing just simply from the technology operating as it should, being used as it should, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a good, you know, segue. I think one of the things I'd like to talk about a little bit is some of the advocacy strategies that are happening, both locally, you know, nationally. Savannah, if you could advance to the advocacy slide. Yep, thank you. I know a few of you have been involved in either making policy recommendations or involved in these coalition groups on the front line. Do any of you want to expand on what is how are communities responding right now? How is Detroit responding right now?
I think each of us could equally respond to this because we all work together on these issues. You know, Alejandro and I and Eric are part of this you know, surveillance related coalition, and we work with Molly's group and use our research very often. And so there's a large and an active community of folks in Detroit specifically. But you know, like I said, the ACLU works statewide, and I get emails from folks in other parts of the state all the time that are concerned about this quickly creeping surveillance state. And it's just an intersection of kind of an over-reliance on police departments to provide public safety. It's kind of just constantly increasing police budgets, and it's this somewhat new fashion of kind of commercial interests where you have tech companies constantly inventing new technologies, which are effectively new toys for police departments to buy, and are going around the country advertising them. And so, you know, every year, there's a new toy that police departments want to buy. And as soon as Detroit buys it, the suburbs buy it, or vice versa. As soon as, the Metro Detroit area buys it, it starts to kind of spread out into the state. And we saw that with license plate readers most recently. And so, as you see this kind of constant purchasing of surveillance technologies that are, nascent, unproven, racially discriminatory, you're seeing more and more people, either individuals or groups, kind of stand up and kind of urging people to kind of pump the brakes on this technology. I can speak to kind of our kind of legal advocacy on the ACLU side, but I also wanted to open up to folks who aren't as kind of always steeped in legal things as we are.
Yeah, for my piece, I'd highlight that this isn't just some, a lot of this pushback isn't just pushing back against surveillance, although that's very, of course, that's very important, and different types of surveillance and the different implications, but it's also taking into account the zero-sum game nature of spending and implementing these technologies, right? When, you're being told that you were overassessed on your home because we needed that money and because we had an underfunded assessor's office, but we got $9 million to spend on audio surveillance and a bunch more on video surveillance, people get riled up because this is money that was not spent on making sure they could stay in their homes, that when they were in their homes, they would indeed be safe. So, here what folks want to see, and where the advocacy usually tends to revolve around is, what's the alternative? We want public safety, we want public investment in safe streets, but it's being done in a way that benefits corporate interests by being able to test their technologies within the city, and puts us in more harm's way than not. So, yeah, within this frame, I just highlight that it's not just pushing back, but also trying to move us away from this over-policing, over-surveillance approach to solving public issues, and towards something that takes into account the individual, the unique needs of Detroiters and other folks like them across the state.
If I could add something to what Alejandro said, which is exactly on point. It is a zero-sum game in terms of budget, but those who are opposed to the surveillance infrastructure, particularly Project Greenlight, are at a disadvantage because there is no line item in the budget for Project Greenlight. And I have heard on numerous occasions members of DPD get up there and say, Project Greenlight doesn't cost the city of Detroit, the police department, anything, because the business owners are paying for the cameras and the bandwidth and signs and lighting and all. And that the city of Detroit isn't paying for it is just a flat out lie, right? I mean, I don't know who pays for, who else pays for the monitors? Who else pays for these real-time crime centers? Who else pays for, the time of both the sworn officers and civilians who monitor this? And in fact, Detroit Justice Center, we did a look into the costs that we could identify, right? And all we could rely on were public statements and some contracts. There's been over $20 million in public money spent on Project Greenlight. Nevertheless, DPD still gets up there and says, look, it's not costing anything. And the problem when you say it's not costing anything is that you don't force people to do a cost-benefit analysis, right? They don't get to the point where they say, oh, this is money this is $20 million that could have been spent on something else. Because if you did that, then you would have to look at the effectiveness of the, theoretical expenditure versus actually spent on Project Greenlight. And the truth is, there is no evidence whatsoever that Project Greenlight has any impact on public safety. There have been 2 studies done, one by the university, one by Michigan State University, and one by School of Criminal Justice, I believe, and one by the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm for the U.S. Department of Justice, and they both found no impact or no effect on crime from Project Greenlight. So there is no evidence Project Greenlight works. The only evidence that exists says it does not work. I've even heard Detroit police commissioners say, you know, we would like to hear something other than anecdotal evidence regarding its efficacy. And we don't get that. So there's no evidence it works, evidence that it doesn't. There is no way of tracking how much is being spent on it. And as Alex said, what you're left with is, for reasons I cannot comprehend, we are spending money on things that don't make communities safer rather than things that do. And Detroit isn't unique in that, you know, more than a quarter of most big cities' general budgets go to law enforcement, but Detroit is particularly bad at it, which seems odd when you look at the places that are safest don't have surveillance or, you know, military surplus or, you know, cops on every street corner. And those are the safest places. So it just goes to show, you know, surveillance doesn't make people safer, but it is expensive.
Yeah. Doesn't make people safer. And we know that poverty is one of the biggest predictors of crime, right? And we have so many cities that have these immense, huge police budgets. And it's like, why don't we take some of that money and put it towards, you know, feeding people and getting people school and social support services? So it is troubling that in Detroit, there isn't an ability to do that cost analysis. Is there anyone who wants to jump in here?
Yeah, you mentioned, you asked about both the advocacy and also sort of the possible policy approaches to dealing with facial recognition and surveillance. And I want to call out what I think has been something that was a good in theory that has not worked in practice, which is something called the Community Input Over Government Surveillance Ordinance, which Detroit passed a few years ago, which was when people were advocating for this ordinance, it was an attempt to create some opportunities for real resident involvement over decision-making in what kinds of surveillance tools get used, getting access to the data once it's in place to see, is it working? Who is it affecting? Are there inequities? But as it was eventually passed, it was pretty toothless, and people who had initially supported it had to withdraw their support because they said, this is not going to do what we need. It's now been a couple of years and that has turned out to be true. And so there's so asking to just ban a technology can seem really extreme. And well, what about community oversight? What about more involvement in decision making? And that moment has passed, at least in Detroit. And we've seen that the police department, as Eric was saying, is just so unaccountable, and it's impossible to get data out of them. There's all kinds of information that we just don't see, such that you have to take a stronger stance against these tools because that's all that's left.
Right. Absolutely. Anybody else want to jump in about any other sort of policy advocacy, things that are happening even in Detroit right now, or? Okay. All right. So now I'm going to turn it over to Savannah, and we are going to talk a little bit about some specific local cases. And I know some of you may have been involved.
Yeah, so I'm sorry.
Go.
Yeah, so we want to talk about some significant local cases that have had some legal implications. These people have been affected by facial recognition technology. I know ACLU has been connected to some of these cases and have represented people like Robert Williams, who is a Detroit man who has been falsely accused. Did anyone want to jump in, talk about these cases, its relation to AI and facial recognition technology, and sort of the implications around the legal history of it as well?
I can start, since we at the ACLU represent Robert Williams in his lawsuit against the Detroit Police Department. So as of now, there are 3 cases that we know of. There could be many more. There are 3 cases that we know of people being wrongfully arrested by the Detroit Police Department on the basis of a facial recognition match. All 3 are Black, which is to no one's surprise based on what we know about the technology and how it falsely identifies people of color at rates much higher than white people, as we talked about earlier. So what happened to Robert Williams is that he lives in Farmington Hills, 30, 45 minutes outside of Detroit. And there was an alleged theft of some watches from a Shinola store, the watch store in Midtown Detroit, a store that Robert hadn't been to for maybe 7, 8 years at that point. He went to the store once for, I think, his brother's birthday, and hadn't been to in about 10 years. And this theft was occurring at the same time he was on Instagram Live driving home from work. And yet, as you can see in that middle picture, the Detroit Police Department used its, at the time, new facial recognition technology, ran that surveillance footage, weird angle, dark, blurry, through its one-to-many database search, and the database spit out Robert Williams as one of the possible matches. And the department just kind of ran with that. There's a thing called algorithmic bias, where people kind of trust algorithms and technology simply because they are advertised as objective and high tech, and people see the movies and the TV shows about these kinds of technologies, and so they kind of just ran with that facial recognition search. Did a cursory investigation, asked a security consultant who wasn't even an eyewitness to look at the footage, look at a picture of Robert among other pictures who looked much less like the guy in the footage, and she naturally picked out Robert after knowing that there was a supposed facial recognition match. And so Detroit police officers went out to Robert's home, arrested him as he pulled into his driveway in front of his wife and kids. Held him in the DDC, the Detroit Detention Center, for 30 or so hours, and interrogated him about this theft and a bunch of other thefts that he obviously had nothing to do with and hadn't even been to those stores. And it wasn't until much later, during a preliminary hearing in the case, that the prosecution barely admitted its mistake, but at least decided not to prosecute Robert. And so that's what happened to Robert. And this is, like I said, it's one of 3 cases in the city of Detroit. This also happened to a man named Michael Oliver and a woman named Portia Woodruff. Same situation, where there's security footage or cell phone video, an incident. The Detroit Police Department, their new kind of instinct is to just run this footage or this photo through facial recognition, see what they get. In Portia's case, the person in the video and kind of the eyewitness reports was not a pregnant person, although Portia was at the time 8 months pregnant. The police were so committed to this technology that, despite its flaws, that they ignored the fact that Portia was 8 months pregnant and still arrested her. Similarly with Michael Oliver, person in the footage that they used didn't have any tattoos on his arms. Michael Oliver had tattoos on his arms. Completely ignored that because they trusted this flawed technology so much, and just with their eyes closed, kind of just arrested these folks. And it's no surprise that there are now 3 lawsuits against the city over its use of facial recognition technology.
If I could point out something about sort of all these cases, that what they kind of have in common, as Ernest was pointing out, and that is that the humans at the end of it who were supposed to be paying attention and the backup utterly failed. And so reflexively we think, well, we should do a better job of doing that. But human nature makes this kind of thing inevitable. I mean, how many people have been driving using using GPS, and it's told you to turn, east when you know for a fact where you want to go is west, you still turn east, right? You figure, well, maybe it's rerouting me. Our trust in technology has gotten to the point where human beings cannot reliably be expected to act as overseers for this technology. We've become too ingrained. How many people paid attention to, daylight savings time, right? It's just all of a sudden 8 hours of your day was taken away. And nobody, most people did not notice, right? We just trust the time on our phone. And the truth is, someone could steal an hour of your day away and you would never notice, right? You wouldn't double check it. So it's become simply saying that we need to put more in place to double check that. It doesn't work because that's just not how people interact with technology anymore. So the solution is to ban it, I think, in the interim until we figure out something, protections or something else. Because saying that we're going to have people, we're going to have an expert or do an analysis after we've kicked out these photos of people with a high confidence value, it's absurd. It's not going to prevent these kind of cases from popping up again and again.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, it's alarming that cases like this are happening, and it makes you really think about what is this doing, not just to those individuals, but how is this traumatizing a community, right? How does being constantly surveilled traumatize a community and a person's sense of not just privacy, but, oh, is there really some bad shit going on here all the time that like I need to be afraid of? And it's really sad. It's sad about just thinking about what this might do on an individual level and then what it does to a group of people, because that's trauma over and over again. This is kind of a side note, but I actually recently had a conversation with Lauren Thomas from Detroit Justice Center, who was talking to me about spot shooter. And this connects to this, like creating a psychological kind of just atmosphere of fear in a community. She was telling me how most recently spot shooter is this thing, and anyone please jump in here, I'm not the expert like you guys are, is this device where it can supposedly pinpoint where gunshot noises are coming from and send that information to the police. And she was telling me that recently it found like 7 different firing sounds, and Fox 2 was, promoting it as one of the most, crime-ridden nights in Detroit history, one of the most dangerous nights it's ever had. And police were going and knocking on people's doors, and they never found anything. And those people were scared. And at the end of the night, they never found out where those gunshots were coming from, if they even existed. They never found or saw anyone get hurt. Never found any guns. And when she told me that story, it really hit like, wow. The way that also then the media will proliferate these messages that you guys are scary and you guys are a danger to others and yourself, which is really tragic. I don't know if anyone wants to add to just kind of the psychological impact of being misidentified, of having the surveillance everywhere, what it does to a community.
So I comment, but I have to give disclosure. I'm currently engaged in litigation with the city over ShotSpotter. We're currently in the Michigan Court of Appeals. But with that caveat out there, so clearly I have an opinion about this particular matter. But ShotSpotter, which is now called Sound something else.
Sound
I
thinking.
forgot what, huh?
Sound thinking.
Yeah, Sound Thinking. It's changed its name.
Oh,
Right, is ostensibly a gunshot detection technology. Anybody who's ever lived in a city for any amount of time knows that, one, that's just silly because there are too many things that happen in a city that potentially sound like a gunshot. And studies have shown ShotSpotter isn't particularly good at picking out gunshots. And believe it or not, ShotSpotter actually has people on the back end who are supposed to analyze whether or not what was heard was in fact actually a gunshot. The problem goes beyond what my colleague Lauren pointed out, as far as people suddenly having the police swoop down on them looking for a gunshot that may or may not have taken place. It's also the police are entering an environment where they are under the impression that a weapon has been fired, right? So having a cop, and again, disclosure, my father's retired DPD, my son is actually currently a police officer, right? So, it's not like I have, a beef with, DPD, but when you have a police officer rushing to a scene with the belief that there is a weapon that has been fired, they have a very different posture than they would otherwise, which is not safe for anybody involved in that. And that is the last thing we want, particularly in communities of color, which is cops rolling up thinking, yo, something's about to pop off. That's not good.
Yeah.
And when you look at, again, what you get for the money, it's actually not a win-win, because it's obviously reactive, right? So it's not really going to decrease crime, because if a crime has taken place when the gun was fired, it's already happened, right? So it doesn't decrease crime like that. It actually creates a problem because there's so many false reports that you actually end up spending more in overtime on police officers than you would if you didn't have ShotSpotter in place. So ShotSpotter is an expensive, ineffective toy. On top of that, and this is where my current case comes in, it also shows the shortcomings in some of the protections that we have put in place. There's currently in Detroit an ordinance called the Civilian Input Over Government Surveillance, which, if that sounds sort of like convoluted title, it's because it is what we have in Detroit is a watered down version of a model ordinance called Civilian Control Over Police Surveillance. It's a model ordinance that's put together by Electronic Frontier Foundation, ACLU, a number of other civil liberties organizations that in theory provide some control over police surveillance. And it does so, and in Detroit, it's an ordinance that goes to procurement. So there are, for surveillance technology, there are heightened disclosure and notice provisions before city council can approve the purchase of that kind of technology. And city council has routinely ignored it. In fact, the city argued that ShotSpotter wasn't covered, despite the fact that gunshot detection technology is specifically listed in the ordinance, right? The city of Detroit actually made the argument that city council is free to ignore the ordinance when they want, and that, nobody can sue under the ordinance because, it's just for the general good. So even in cases where we have a technology that has been shown, and other places have actually gotten rid of ShotSpotter because of its inefficiency and ineffectiveness, like Chicago, for example, even in the face of that, the protections that we put in place are constantly being undermined by this push on behalf of law enforcement to bring in additional means of surveillance. And if you really ever want to get involved in something, getting control of that kind of thing meaningfully, not just through ordinances, but also through the elections of the oversight body, like the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners, is really, really, really important.
So those are great intervention strategies that you mentioned. Like getting involved in the police commission, you said, the oversight commission. And I know that there have been cities that are trying to currently regulate, including the city of Ann Arbor, something that I'm involved in, the use of facial recognition technology, or just trying to see what we can do before it even starts, at least here. So that is something that we are looking at as well, but thanks for sharing that. So just to be mindful of time, at 1:15, we are going to open up for some questions. Before we do so, we didn't get a chance to really talk about facial recognition technology in schools. and Molly, your report. And, you know, because we know as a society that we kind of have trained, we've socialized, unfortunately, the school to prison pipeline, right? What we start young and really over punishing, especially Black boys and brown boys. Then we expect them to eventually enter the criminal legal system. Can you talk, Molly, a little bit about what is happening with schools and surveillance right now?
Yeah, thanks. So, you know, the school, there's a big narrative around school safety and cameras. That's probably the one that is most connected to the conversation we've been having so far, around this idea of preventing school shootings and keeping students safe. But Aisha, you asked earlier about the sort of like psychological effects of being watched and surveilled like this. And I think some of the harms of facial recognition in schools, again, beyond the stuff we've already talked about in terms of the inaccuracy and the unequal impacts, are things like the ways that it disrupts trust between students and their schools. When there are cameras in a school, students feel like they're not trusted. There's research establishing this, that they feel like the school doesn't trust them. They feel less engaged. They are less likely to have a teacher who they feel they can go to when they're having a problem. There's always scope creep with any sort of surveillance technology like this. So it may start out that we're putting cameras in these schools in order to keep out people who might come and cause, you know, do violence. But what ends up happening is that students are it starts to get used for student discipline. It gets used for things like seeing students in the halls when they're not supposed to be there, students wearing things that are outside of the dress code, and it starts to create this really narrow understanding of what an acceptable student looks like and what an acceptable student is and does. There's another one I wanted to talk about, which is that there's research that when there are police in schools, undocumented parents don't go to the school. They don't participate in their child's education. They don't feel they don't feel welcome there. And we know there's so much decades of education research that parental involvement is a huge predictor of student outcomes. And when you put police in schools, here's a whole community, a whole population of students whose parents cannot be involved. And what we expect, although at the time that we did this report, it was too early because the facial recognition wasn't really in schools yet, is that it's going to be the same impact. When you're putting in cameras that are connecting people to systems that go to ICE, that go to the police, that again, there will be parents who don't feel they can show up at the school. And it's likely to go beyond just undocumented parents to parents with warrants, parents with past involvement in the criminal legal system. And that is another kind of harm, both to the student and what I would say to the entire school community. So those are some examples of the specific school impacts that we identified in the report. And I think something that I want to point out specifically to this audience of social workers is that so often in a context like a school, the use of facial recognition is not necessarily about safety, it's about convenience. Using facial recognition to get let into the building, to check out library books, to pay for your lunch. And again, when you have a system that doesn't work equally for all students, you have students who are left out of these systems, students who are made to feel that they are not welcome, that library books are not for them. And so what may seem at first like a way to achieve efficiency is much more likely to again cause these harms that are often invisible, at least at first.
Thank you, Molly. It's
Yeah.
disturbing, to say the least. Does anyone else want to jump in really quickly? We have about 2 more minutes until Q&A about anything Molly said or anything they want to add. Okay. You know, I think just quickly saying a little bit about why should social workers care. You know, as social workers,
Quick, Aisha, there's a question in the Q&A.
who was there? Okay, let me check it out.
Jamila Simmons.
Okay, Jamila, we can go ahead and unmute you and you can ask this question. Jamila, go ahead.
Hi, greetings to everyone. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation, and my question is just surrounding, as you mentioned, any stats regarding the psychological impact of facial recognition. I know that you talked about the three individuals and their journeys, but any statistics that you found outside of it leading to depression, suicidality, anything such as that?
I'm not aware of any sort of population kinds of statistics. I think partly it's still new enough that we don't have a lot of those sort of larger kinds of data collection available. But some of the studies that I was referring to earlier, where we do have data, is looking at the use of cameras in schools, sort of leaving aside the application of facial recognition, but just bringing surveillance into those contexts and the kind of psychological impacts that that has.
Okay. And any regarding the intersection of skin tone inequities?
In terms of psychological impacts or just the existence of the inequities?
The existence in terms of, I know that BIPOC communities are surveilled much more at a higher rate, but also is it more of a darker skin tone individuals are having a severe impact versus individuals of lighter skin tone?
Yeah, there's a lot of accuracy data out there that that does exist around just like, you know, putting in faces with different characteristics, how accurate the systems are likely to be. So that data is out there, and it, as we were talking about at the start, it encompasses both things like skin tone, but also things like disability, facial differences, gender, and age.
Okay. I'm definitely gonna just be researching this. I think it's very helpful. I am a resident of North Carolina, and we don't have as much, but I think that it's something that will continue to be a problem as surveillance is put within the community. So thank you.
Could I add one thing, and that is, in addition to the, you know, disability and race and gender, I would also add it can be particularly problematic for individuals who are either non-binary or transgender, and you're dealing suddenly with uh, essentially being misgendered by a computer of all things, right? Not good.
Yes. Thank
I'll
you.
also add that, you know, there are studies showing the psychological and physical health impacts of racially disparate policing in general, and, you know, surveillance being a tool of policing. I think those could be helpful, and I'm happy to provide those if you just reach out via email. Another thing I'll say is that, you know, uh, in terms of accuracy and kind of target statistics, there are agencies like the Detroit Police Department that publish statistics on that are required to publish statistics on their facial recognition use, and those, you know, statistics don't, you know, entail or have to do with psychological impacts, but they are telling. I mean, I don't know if I can post one example. This might only go to panelists, but you know, like I said, the police department releases monthly, or supposed to release monthly and annual reports on facial recognition use, and they're telling you what they're doing. The one I posted is from 2021 for 2020 data. You go to page 2, 100% of the facial recognition searches they ran were on photos of Black people. So add that to facial recognition being, you know, working worse on people of color, especially Black people. Add that to the fact that facial recognition is being deployed in majority Black cities like Detroit. Now you're seeing racially disparate kind of deployment of the technology in an already majority Black city. 100% Black probe photos, which is what we call the input photos that go into the facial recognition system. And so, you know, I think studies showing psychological impact of this is important, and there are studies about racially disparate policing in general. And at the same time, the police department is publishing their intent on the internet.
Thank you. Is it possible for everyone to place their emails in the chat?
Mhm.
We haven't been able to put anything in the chat that goes to the odd. Oh wait, Aisha, you can. Okay.
I can, and just as
I
an yeah, as an FYI, we're gonna send a resource follow-up email after this that will include a recording, links we shared. I can ask panelists if they feel comfortable with me sharing emails, and those that do, I will include it. So that will be coming to everyone who registered for this.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for asking the question. Next up, I see Laura Sanders. We're gonna unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I don't know how to turn my camera on with this.
I don't know if you can.
Okay, that's okay. Not important. I am a Leo instructor at the School of Social Work, and I'm teaching an organizing against inhumane immigration enforcement course this weekend. And as many of you probably know, 2 social workers are running on the Democratic ticket for sheriff, Alicia Dyer and Derek Jackson. This is not a campaign event because we're not allowed to do that at the School of Social Work, but both of them are coming in on Sunday afternoon separately. Alicia is coming from 1 to 1:45, and Derek is coming from 2 to 2:45. And we have put forth a set of questions for them as to how they are integrating social work ethics into their policy platforms in running for sheriff. We are going to be asking these questions about what do they think about license plate readers? What do they think about facial recognition? These kinds of things that affect especially the undocumented immigrant community and other communities of color. What do they think about these enhanced surveillance kinds of mechanisms? So, and it's open to the whole school. So if you would like to come, it's from 1 to 3 in B780 in the basement of the School of Social Work. And you can hear the two of the folks that you would have a choice to vote for talk about their ideas. Thanks. And thank you for this great presentation.
Thank you, Laura. So that will be on Sunday.
Yeah, it's
in
on
the School of
Sunday.
Social Work.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
To Tobias, I know that you had a question earlier in the session. I can allow you to talk if you want to ask it now.
I'm good.
You're okay?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
I guess my question is, given all of these lawsuits, given all of this misrecognition, given all these problems, outside of just kind of leaning into and saying we trust the technology, is there any official response that kind of acknowledges these things, or is it most like we're just going to keep on doing what we're doing? Because it's not like it's a unknown problem.
Yeah, everybody else feel free to jump in. I'm gonna look at this as a cup half full type of thing. What they've been starting to do is try to cook up the numbers to make it seem like it is much more effective than it is. That the flaws aren't as present in all of these alerts in the aggregate, as as we stated from the get-go, right? Before they implemented facial recognition, we've been saying it's going to lead to these outcomes, and now they're claiming that, they're not using it as much, that they're a lot more accurate, what have you. They're cooking the numbers. I'll just say it out loud. But however, I think I see that as an improvement upon denying it, and forbidding any access to that data. Of course, from here, what we want to get to is like, no, give us the full data that we can analyze ourselves and actually verify how much of this was misidentification, and how much, resources, how many resources you spend on this. But yeah, long story short, they're never gonna acknowledge it. We can only push them at the margins to confirm that some of these negative outcomes are taking place, if that's being clear.
Alex is more optimistic than I am with the whole glass half full. I mean, there's actually there's a justification for that, but what I would say is that too often what we're seeing is continued denial, right? And it's transparency has to be complete if it's going to be meaningful. I mean, in one sense, we have gone from Chief Craig saying, I believe in my heart that it works despite the complete and utter absence of evidence, to at least our current Chief White relying on anecdotal evidence, but not producing any real data, right? So I guess that's the half glass kind of full. But if we don't stay engaged, if people do not stay engaged, it won't last. I mean, there was all this work put into passing the SEOGS ordinance, and it has been truly ineffective. And until we get it amended to actually put some teeth into it, having pretend protections in place is worse than having no protections in place. It's a false sense of security, which is actually what a lot of these surveillance programs provide to begin with, a false sense of security. So I don't know if we can say that I'd like to think Alex is right, but deep in my heart, I'm worried he's not.
I'll add something that I feel similarly, and I think it's that there's a denial of the systemic issues with these technologies, but it's concerning the lengths to which at least the Detroit Police Department is where I have the most familiarity, the extent to which the Detroit police will go to preserve their access to this technology. In Robert's case, the police chief got up in front of the Board of Police Commissioners and said, we messed up. The city's top lawyer even said, we're conceding liability in this case, which, presents the question of why they're fighting this case so hard still. But, the police are willing to, it's the same kind of like bad apples mentality that the police approach a lot of things with, but the police are willing to, throw individual officers under the bus and say that officer messed up his investigation. They're willing to admit mistakes in individual cases, but that's just kind of a shield or a cover for their unwillingness to admit that this isn't just kind of a mistake or an aberration. This is the technology itself doing, what we all expected it to do. And I don't think the police are there yet. And I'm also pessimistic that they will get there. Although, you see places like Chicago and Dayton and a few other places who have said, you know what, it's not worth the money for ShotSpotter at least. So there's some silver lining, but I think we have a ways to go.
I want to say one. I went with the glass half full because I knew Eric would come with the glass half empty. I got the whole approach. But then I to make a call to action at this point, right? There is no, when it comes to demanding transparency, there's no act that's too small, especially for the folks that are on this call. If you're doing analysis on this and you're hitting a wall, do the same thing that we do and bug the hell out of the Chief Information Office, DPD, to let them know that eyes are on this case. People who care about this issue and want the truth out of what the data is actually saying. Yeah, folks want the truth. So I'd say, please keep doing that if that's something that you're doing. Because yeah, where we are getting our victories, right, as like a concession of liability, is by letting them know that we're watching and we're going to act on it. If we didn't let them know that they probably wouldn't have gotten that concession. They would have just swept it under the rug, as they have been able to do with some of the other cases that we're sure we don't even know about, because we didn't see it and let them know we saw it. So.
Well, thank you, everyone. This was really an amazing session. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining. I want to thank the attendees for all your great questions. I'm just going to speak briefly about implications for social work practice. I think as social workers, we should be driven to action when we hear about things like this. So think about how you can get involved. Panelists, if you have opportunities or campaigns for students to get involved in, please let me know and I'll send it out in the resource email. But then also, if you're an IP and you're giving therapy to a person, think about the traumatic kind of psychological harm and impact that a person could have experienced if they grew up in a community that's heavily surveilled, right? If you're doing community organizing, think about what are the policies and that are around surveillance and facial recognition technology. Now, can you galvanize folks to get involved in that change? And then policy, obviously, show up, ask questions, and try to push for policy change. Laura Sanders, I think you gave a good example of a place where a social worker should be showing up and asking candidates for sheriff, what are their thoughts on this? So thank you all again for joining. Real quickly, we have an upcoming virtual discussion happening on April 18th called The Case for Reparations. We have some great panelists on that one too. We're going to drop the RSVP into the chat. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.